Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us in our session today, where we will discuss gender diversity in business. This session is part of INSEAD's Sustainable Development Goals Week program, organized by the Hoffman Institute. My name is Beril Çelikman, and I'm an MBA student at INSEAD, and I'm also the president of INSEAD's Women in Business Club. I'll be hosting today's session with my colleague, Ferdinand von Arenstoff, who is also an INSEAD student and one of the club leaders. Our guest speaker today is Bianca Bax, an expert partner in humanized change at Bain & Company, and she's joining us from Bain Amsterdam. And on behalf of everyone, welcome Bianca, and thank you for joining us tonight. We're very excited to hear about your invaluable perspectives and experience on this very important subject.
Thank you, Beryl. It's an absolute pleasure of mine to be able to talk to you today about a topic that's very, very close to my heart. And although we're all muted, I do hope there's going to be some kind of interaction. There will be plenty of Q&A possibility. And Beryl and Ferdinand and I will have a little bit of a conversation, making sure it's not my monologue that you're listening to. Now, at the start, who am I? I think diversity, equity, and inclusion, one of the key foundations is we need to understand each other a little bit better. So let me start by introducing myself from who I think I am. So, as Beryl said, I'm an expert partner at Humanized Change in Bain Amsterdam. I was actually born in Cape Town out of two Belgian parents, but I've lived in the Netherlands for most of my life. That might not sound as exotic or as different, but it does give you a little bit of a different mix. I've done many different schools, unfortunately, not INSEAD. I'm an engineer by background. I've also done a coaching course just because I wanted to get a little bit more outside of my head and inside my heart. And I joined Bain Amsterdam in 1999, and I was number 13, so one of the first, and actually the first woman on the ground at that point. I became a partner in 2015, and actually in 2020 decided to focus all of my attention on the human side of change, from the perspective that you need to be as rigorous about the human side of change as you are about the analytical side of change if you want to go for lasting results. And I'm not just a consultant, I also have a family. I've got two sons of 9 and 11. My biggest hobby is actually just to watch them play soccer. I care a lot about our community too. I'm a board member for Huis aan het Water, which is a place for people with and after cancer. And I'm also the treasurer of our parent council, which is in our little village. That's a little bit about me. And so let's now get into the topic that you've been waiting for. What are we going to do today? Three things. One, we're going to reflect on what DE&I, diversity, equity, and inclusion, actually is and why it matters. Then we're going to zoom in on gender parity and select best practices, as was the topic for this webinar. And then we'll go into answering some of your questions, I hope. So let's start with diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's the right thing to do, and also actually gets you to direct business results. And why are we actually saying that? Because it's not just societal good, but if you're a good company and you care about diversity, equity, and inclusion, that's actually going to give you better results. Why? 45% of companies are more likely to report market growth if they have diverse management teams. 35% are going to have higher returns if you actually have racial and ethnic diversity if you're in the top quartile. And actually, if you look at it, 20% increase in sales is actually possible if you've got engaged people and if they actually feel included. Now, Beryl, I know you had a couple of questions for me on those that maybe you can ask me on behalf of the broader audience.
Absolutely. Yeah, the first time I've seen these statistics, it was very eye-opening. But the first thing I thought was, how do people even calculate this? Because this is such a hard subject to measure. And if in your experience, do you have any ways to measure these? Would be great to share.
Yeah, definitely. And so it's hard to make a direct comparison, right? But when it comes to market share growth, when you're introducing new products and you've seen that you've got a more diverse team, there is a lot of data in terms of when you first launch a new product, what is the typical market share? And so just looking at that data, by the way, none of this data is Bain proprietary. It comes from very different sources, from Gallup to HBR, etc. Right? So it's not even our own data, but that's the way to look at it. And actually, besides just this, which is the outcome side, which a lot of companies obviously care about, we also know more and more customers, a lot of research around that too, more and more customers demand it. More and more talent cares about diversity, equity, inclusion when choosing their next employer. And actually quite recent work that I've done with our team at Bain when it comes to inclusive organizations also shows that if you've got a more inclusive, diverse team, you're going to get more innovation. Because when you're coming from more and different angles, you're going to come up with solutions that aren't so mainstream and therefore much better suited. So there's a couple of things that are proof points. So let's continue. Sorry.
Yeah, I also wanted to add, like, as you said, like when there is a diverse team on the ground, the results are usually much more exceptional, and also the way of working is much better, as in the process, it's much more eye-opening, it's more informative, and also fun to hear about people's different perspectives, how they perceive the world so differently.
Yeah, and I think that's also part of what you're experiencing at INSEAD. Now, in a way, some people would argue that it's still a homogeneous group, right? If you get to go to business school, but if you get the different backgrounds, you start to get a little bit of a sniff of what that means.
Absolutely, yes.
And that brings us actually to the next point, because I don't know whether you've experienced it or anyone in the webinar, but diverse teams can also be difficult. Because when people come from different perspectives that might not be your own, you might either be surprised or not agree. And so that's why diversity by itself is not going to be the solution. So let's discuss what actually the different components of diversity, equity, and inclusion mean. So diversity is pure, if you will, from the axis of what are the different types of people that you have. It can be on demographics, like race and gender and sexual orientation, but it can actually also be on personal traits. I don't know about you, but usually an introvert and an extrovert aren't necessarily the best combination, it seems. But what if you could understand each other better and listen? That is actually when the magic happens. That's when you make the bridge to inclusion. So diversity without inclusion is not going to help much. And actually, you can recruit the hell out of it and get your diverse teams in place. But if you're not inclusive, then one, your results are actually going to be worse than a nicely homogeneous team. And two, your diverse talent is going to walk away if they don't feel included. So they actually go hand in hand. Diversity without inclusion won't get you the retention that you need. And then you've got the equity piece. And that's an interesting one too. It's equity and not equality. Why? Because, for instance, if you start recruiting and you get the number of people to actually apply with the same percentages as the organization or the rest of society when it comes to diversity of, for instance, in terms of race, then you don't know whether their background has been coached enough to get them to the same level. So yes, they get the opportunities, but the chance of success isn't big enough. So if we want to get to true equity, you need to figure out how you can bypass some of the structural reasons that make it difficult for some populations to actually get to equal chances. So if you're truly committed to this, this is what you need to do. And sometimes equity is a smaller thing, like pay equity is very current, right? So making sure that, for instance, when it comes to gender, you pay women the same for the same job as you do for men. And how do you do it? And if you want to do it on aggregate, how does that work? How do you get women in the same levels of position so that you actually pay them the same thing? And it can actually be bigger, right? For instance, what you see in the United States a lot is people with different racial backgrounds don't have the same chances of getting a college degree. So how are you ever going to get a representative number of people to apply if they don't have the college degrees? So some companies are actually going in and committing to hiring more people of color, and that actually means that they need to start to support them to actually go through college. So it's a very different thing. And sometimes we talk about it as, diversity and inclusion are maybe the first things to start on, but the structural things are really going to make the difference. So they're all interrelated. And then I just wanted to take a small step back. When we talk diversity, equity, inclusion, sometimes we feel it's all only women or it's only people of color that feel it. But there's two things I want to discuss. One, inclusion is critical to thriving for any person, because it's actually known when you look at research that the piece of the brain that actually lights up when you feel excluded is the same piece of your brain that lights up when you're actually in physical pain. And I don't know about you, but when I'm in physical pain, I'm not at my best. I don't perform the same way I do when I'm in pain versus when I'm not. So anytime people feel excluded, that's actually going to hamper their ability to perform. And behavior is very different, right? And the perception plays a big role. So if we're not intentionally including, we're accidentally excluding people. Now just think about what that means in terms of performance. If that was the only thing you cared about, right? Forget about, the decent thing to do in respect to show people. And so I want to ask, I'm actually going to ask Beryl anyway, but the whole audience, what was the time that you felt excluded? Can you remember a time? What was the context?
Unfortunately, I can remember a number of times. And when you mentioned that physical pain, I can only think of one very particular memory that I would like to share. So this is about being a woman, because I'm coming from a male-dominated industry, also from Turkey. So I'm one of the very few women in the workplace. And this one memory that really affected me was when I was working with a very traditional client where all the executives were male. We were two analysts on the team, and I was the only woman, a very actually common setup. But then when we started working in a very short period of time, I started realizing my senior clients started calling my colleague with words like my boy, my lion, which might sound a bit absurd, but it's a very acceptable way of showing love in Turkish language, even in a business context. And then with me, their attitude was completely different. I was Miss Çelikmen. Some of them would not even shake my hand, because that's also a practice in some Muslim communities. And I felt very excluded for sure. But then what was even worse was, for a long while, I thought this was because of my performance, and I just was not up to my peers' standards. And I also thought, I really believed that I would never, ever get to that relationship level anyways with the clients. And what did they say about my future success in my career? This was the first year when I started working. So I can totally understand, empathize with that physical pain. It took a while to start differentiating these things and try not to see it too personal, though not always possible.
No, thank you for sharing, Beryl. I've got a couple of stories like that too, but I can promise you, we're in the middle of doing some research on inclusive organizations. Do you know that even straight white males, who are regarded the majority in many different pieces of our world, don't necessarily feel more included than any of the underrepresented populations? Now, what you need to do to make people feel more included might be different. But what I want to stress here is that every person sometimes feel excluded. And if you go to that place and in terms of what that feels like, I don't think anybody wishes that about anybody else. And so that's one of the reasons that we should all care about inclusion. And so just zooming in on gender, right? Why does it matter? And I don't know, I've done quite a lot of research across the world, and we've been at this for a while, right? It's not the first time that organizations are trying to improve when it comes to, for instance, gender. And they are usually not seeing that much uplift as they were hoping. And that's partly because of systemic barriers. And what are some of those, right? So 80% of the women say that stereotyping, it's a little bit what you were talking about, Beryl, is a barrier to women's advancement to senior levels. I was talking to someone in private equity, and he said you know, I have this great bond with the men, and the women were complaining they are not having such a good bond with me. And I asked them why, and the women said, well, when you walk around the office, you give the boys, the man, a pat on the back, and you don't do that with us. And he said, of course I'm not doing that, because we're in the middle of Me Too. I don't want people to say that I touched them. So we're getting into a very complicated world where stereotyping is a piece of it, but we're starting to not understand anymore what it is we need to do. And I know we're going to get to that a little bit later, but that's why also allyship is so important, and why it's so important to not just talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion within the underrepresented groups, but we need to have the conversations with also the different types of majorities. And all of us sometimes are also in a majority too, when it comes to either education level, or maybe skin color, or maybe gender. We are all sometimes in majority situations too. And then what do? Do we stereotype? And this is one of the things, right? Even a Black woman rights fighter at some point said in her TED talk, she said, I do this every single day, right? I'm a Black woman. I fight for my rights as a woman. She said, I boarded a plane, and there was a pilot, a female pilot, coming on to the mic. And she said, good morning, this is your pilot speaking. She's like, yes, it's a woman. We got into the cockpit, right? She was celebrating. And then they took off, and there was a lot of turbulence. And she said, all of a sudden in her head, it went, oh my goodness, I hope she can fly. Now, if that goes through the head of a Black woman's rights fighter, it goes through all of our heads. So we're all biased. So we're human and we're biased. Let's now make an effort to crack those biases open, because they're not the right thing to do. But all of us have got work to do. Anyway, going back to this. Also, besides being stereotyped, if you're looking at the difference in terms of likelihood of having a sponsor, and sponsor not in terms of money, but actually someone who fights for you when you're not in the room, there's actually 1.5 times more likelihood that a man has one than a woman. And that makes a difference, and we'll see it in a second. And also, when you look at feedback, and this is done by scraping all of the reviews, right? Development feedback is tied to business outcomes only in 40% of the cases versus 60% men. Now, what does that mean? A lot of times it's about behavior. It's about whether you're shy or not, whether you're opening your mouth enough. And so there is a difference in gender there too. And so when we start to review and performance manage people, do we look at it with the same ways? Would we give the same feedback to a man as we would to a woman? It's just something to keep in mind, because none of us is unbiased. And yes, you can mitigate. So that's the good news. And this is just not exhaustive, but just to give you a couple of things that do matter. So if you want to counter some of the biases, it's important to have a strategy, to talk about who's in charge, and to have accountability. What does that mean? Things like, let's make sure we communicate how important diversity, equity, inclusion is to our business outcomes. This is not just a charity thing, but let's go out, make it transparent, have a goal, and try and reach it. Let's also make sure that especially leadership, and fortunately, still much more important, role models, what it looks like to actually have inclusive behavior and to embrace, if you will, the different diversity. If that doesn't happen at the leadership level, unfortunately, you could nearly stop. It's not just going to come from the rest of the organization. That's one. The other one is you need to make sure that you talk to your different underrepresented groups enough, because especially if you come from the majority, you won't really know what the lived experiences are from people that are different from you. So you need to make sure that you track data. It can be sentiment data. You can have pulse checks that you do every now and then, and use the feedback to actually make a difference, because that's the only thing that will really help. And then obviously making sure that you provide the training and the education is important. Now, one of the things that at least where we come from feel strongly about, it's hard to make it involuntary. It's hard to make it something that everybody's got to do, because you might actually just get it to tick the box and not to get it really lived. So it's an important one to think about. Even if we want to, it's much more important to think about how can we get the dialogue going and ongoing, how do we change behaviors across, than get everybody through training per son. Now then the other two, that's what we're going to deep dive a little bit on today, is sponsorship and mentorship. They're two different things. Sometimes we say the difference is a mentor is someone who coaches you when you're in the room, and a sponsor is someone who's on the table and singing your praises also when you're not in the room. So it's different. And we've seen, and we'll go into that a little bit with a little bit more detail too, that if you've got sponsorship and advocates in place formally, that makes a difference in terms of inclusion and in feeling of belonging, and that will help people stay. And why is this important? Because especially for underrepresented groups, you can imagine if you are 10 people, if you will, just at an entry level, and maybe there's one person senior in the organization of that same underrepresented groups, say a female, but it could also just be someone with a different background, then how are you going to get that sponsorship in place? You can only do that by getting people from a different group to sponsor. And we've seen in our research actually that when it comes to inclusion, pure inclusion, it's equally important to have someone to sponsor than if the identity of the person is the same. That doesn't mean that you might not prefer to have someone from your own group. And I know, Beryl, you've got an experience with that too. But sponsorship, even if you're not at the levels that you want to in the whole of your organization, already matters. Mentorship is much more about ongoing coaching and mentoring and making sure that people get the transparent feedback to get better. Again, we're doing a lot of research on inclusive organization. And one of the things that binds every single human being is that we want to do good in our job. We want to grow and we want to get in transparent feedback. And naturally, we're usually coaching people that are more like us. So that's why you need to formalize these things so that it actually is much more equitable. And then last but not least, there's employee research groups. They're also called affinity groups. So making sure that people with different underrepresented groups, even if it is across countries, connect and have a way to form a network and help and support each other is a very important thing to raise inclusion, as well as allyship. And allyship is something different from sponsorship and mentorship. It is actually if you're helping someone outside of the group that you're in and actually amplify the voices. And we're actually going to that. So for instance, a straight white male as an ally to maybe women or to the LGBTIQ plus community can be extremely helpful, but also as a female to the other group. Everybody can be an ally. So sponsorship, let's start there first. And Beryl, I'd love to hear a little bit more from you, but when women are sponsored, there's an enormously positive impact on how people feel and how included people feel. And so just getting that in place in a way is like a no regret move. Beryl, did you want to share something about sponsorship?
So I was very lucky to have very, very good sponsors for me, two particularly, both male, but having them has been like one of the best things in my career because they really opened the doors for me. And I never felt like I was missing out on anything because they were male. But honestly, like it's not always about male or female when you click with a person and that person knows the best for you. However, as I go further in my career, I really feel the absence of a woman sponsor as well, because even though, as you mentioned, sponsorship is different than mentorship, you still get that, like, you also get some mentorship from your sponsors because they are the ones that listen to you, that understand you and give you suggestions, recommendations in your career. So in my case, I loved these sponsors of mine. But when it comes to life decisions, family decisions, or even like leadership styles, sometimes I do feel the lack of a woman because I feel like I'm like being put into some certain boxes and I'm not really understood. Like I'm told, for example, about very like classic decision. When do I make get a child? What's going to happen to my career? And my sponsor would be like, hey, it's just 6 months out of 40 years of a career. It won't matter. But then I look around and then, well, there is no woman around me. So there obviously is a pattern that you really haven't figured out yet. So some things I think really come from the same group as you. So I think definitely needs both.
Yeah.
Opposite and the same.
No, and I think it's a good point. If there aren't any others, it's important actually to have that mentorship. And we sometimes actually say reverse mentorship. So actually you assign a senior person to maybe an underrepresented group member, and they just share their lived experiences, right? That's also a way to do it. But to your point, Beryl, we actually just started about a year or two ago. I'm now mapped to women from different offices, because I won't be their sponsor, because I don't have a direct line into them when it comes to their development and their career. But given that I'm in a different office, I can obviously at least talk to those type of things. So we need to also get a little bit more creative in how we're reaching out and what are the networks that we form. Great, let me continue, because I want to make sure we've got enough time also for your Q&A. So we wanted to talk a little bit about allyship, what it is and what it isn't, right? It is a role that everybody can play. It's not just, oh, only if I'm straight, white, man, and cisgender, I can do it. No, any of these things actually can make you different from somebody else. And sometimes actually it's hierarchical. So if you've made a couple of steps, you can help other people that are at a different level, right? So you can look for it very proactively. We're going to talk about what actually proactive and reactive is. It is about an active and a constant practice. And so there is learning and action required in terms of how you can do better. It's not just, here are the 10 things, and if everybody just do that, if everybody does that, then you're done. It doesn't work like that. It is about also self-awareness in terms of what's my own identity? Who do I identify most with? And how do I actually go out of my own little bubble? It is not an identity to claim just to say, hey, I care about DE&I, therefore I'm an ally. No, it's much more proactive. And actually it is about sharing, in a way, we sometimes say power, but it's pieces of privilege, right? Do you realize how privileged you are? Sometimes through your education, sometimes because of the upbringing you've had, sometimes because of your race, sometimes because of your gender, etc. It is not about saving people. This is not about making sure that, you do your good deeds for the day. This is actually bringing support and helping people to figure it out themselves. So what does that look like? Allyship. So what does proactive allyship looks like? It's basically just to make sure that you're aware of the different groups that are there and making sure that you keep an eye out for who might actually not have the voice in the room. So even when you're in any group has a form of ranking, if we say, a form of who gets the biggest voice, who do we listen to most? And if we care about diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's good to think about what voice would we not be hearing that strongly? And so how can we actually seek that out and ask the person or make sure that the psychological safety is there to do it? The other one is actually reactive. There's an incident, and what do? Right? Do you say something, yes or no? I had this very small thing happening where I was in a client situation and I was presenting, but I was ill. And so I kind of lost my voice and it was a little bit hoarse. And so I started, and the client, who was a CFO, who comes from Holland, and I'd seen before too, and I was in the US at that point at a different part of their organization. He said, "Oh, Bianca, sexy voice." And at that moment, I had a male partner sitting next to him who didn't say anything right at that time, but came back to me and said, "Hey, Bianca, how was that? Because I'm happy to do something about it." And that was enough for me to be okay, right? And that is a way to just make sure that if something happens, that you check with the person whether it's okay or not, and that if it negatively affected someone, that you're willing to do something about it. And so how can we actually be better allies? And I'll ask you, Beryl, in a second, whether you've played a role. And actually, Ferdinand, I'd love to hear from you, whether you've actually stepped up sometimes to be an ally. But before we do that, let's go into, yes, it matters to practice. So mind your own gaps, right? What lived experiences have you not had? I'll be very honest here too. I'm starting to read a book on racial migration in Europe, because oftentimes it's easy to say, oh, the racial piece doesn't play as big a role as it does in the US, in Western Europe. Is that true? Or have we not yet become aware of that? And so educating yourself in where you've got your lived experience and where you don't is actually quite important. Investing in the relationships, right? Just making sure you don't stick with your own crew all the time, and make sure that you share your authentic self with others. That makes it easier for others to do the same thing. And then also, in a way, planning ahead. That's what I said a little bit. If you understand if there's someone going to be the only one or the other one in the group, what can you do to invite them? Sometimes just proactively before the meeting, and sometimes in the meeting. And then in a reactive one, use your voice if you do have more privilege. Don't speak for others, right? Oh, this person might not like it. Speak for yourself. Very important. Amplifying others, right? Just making sure that you give people credit if they're actually not present or overlooked, making sure that voice is heard. And actually just making sure that, and some people say empathy, other people say compassion, right? If you hear something, just support them, listen, advise if you can, and then advocate. But let me pause there for a second, and Beryl and Ferdinand, I would love to hear a little bit from you if this resonates and if this speaks to a situation that you've had before.
Yeah, happy to. Thank you so much, Bianca. And actually something that you mentioned earlier with shifting the focus from just minorities, but to everyone, that this, especially the inclusion part, can hit everyone, rang a bell. And now that you're asking this question, it comes back to mind, because there are so many situations where people have been allies to me that I'm very grateful for, where they just spoke up and said, hey, I noticed this, are you okay? And over time, I think I noticed that I liked it. And so I started trying to do it for friends and colleagues around me. I think the most difficult situation I've encountered so far where I've tried to be an ally was when my partner was facing a lot of exclusion in her organization. And obviously she comes home, she tells me, and I try to be there with empathy or compassion, right? That's the first thing that you can do. And at some point, you take part in it, you get invested. And I had the opportunity to speak to a person in that organization in a somewhat informal context. And I knew that they cared about the topic as well. And I think the point that it came from someone outside and then was carried to the people that practiced that exclusion and that created this environment was even more powerful, because it created this atmosphere of, without blaming or pointing fingers, because that's never helpful, but it created this impression of, this is a message that is creeping outside of our organization, so we need to watch this. And I've seen some improvement. Obviously that's not down to me, right? And I also get it secondhand. Plus my partner is incredibly strong, so she drives that mainly herself. But it is powerful, and I've seen in this situation especially to talk about it and to address it, to address the elephant in the room.
Thanks, Ferdinand. And I think it's also making you much more, in wherever you're going to be in your business life, also much more aware that these type of things might happen. Beryl, maybe you've got another one.
Well, I actually, like, as Fadi said, when you find allyship of other people helping you, you definitely get much more motivated to be an ally for everyone. And I felt like in INSEAD that is being done very well. Like even in the classroom, we can feel that, and you can feel it's a chain that grows. And I'm really appreciating of that. In my experience, I've always tried to be an ally and have had allies, so I am very happy with the experience and willing to continue doing so.
Yeah, that's great. And actually, why is this so important, right? It's because, and this is a psychological thing that's very well known, there is something that's called majority blindness. Some people don't like the word blindness because some people feel it's actually quite conscious. But just because you had different lived experience makes it sometimes very hard to understand why it's getting so much to other people. So when you're outside of that group and you get it and you amplify, at some point, that's what creates the movement, right? Which is why it's so important to have this conversation. I'll add one more thing that's important. That is, in diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's not just about numbers and representation and percentages and all of that. We're doing a lot of research at the moment that's very data-driven. It didn't start to really come to life until we started to share anecdotes about lived experience. Actually, at Bain in Europe, we did a survey, and it wasn't data-driven. It was all about anecdotes. Tell us about a time where you felt less included. Tell me about the time where you did. There was nothing so important to get, if you will, the majority groups within EMEA Bain on the same page to do something about it, as when they got the lived experience and said, you know what? I never thought that's what somebody could feel, but if they do, I want to be different. And so it's a combination. Somebody recently said, it's the data that gets you the plan, but it's the narrative that actually gets you to change. Anyway, we're getting to the end of things, and I'm actually trying to look. I want to just make sure we spend enough time. I want to just say a couple of things in our experience working with a lot of companies when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion. I'll go relatively quickly because I'd love to open it up for questions. So DE&I is an organizational mindset. What we sometimes see is that it's outsourced to HR because HR takes care of people. When you do that, you take away the responsibility that every single person in an organization has to embrace diverse teams, to exercise equity where you can, and to include. So it's very important because it takes all of us all the time through processes to behaviors, and you need strong senior leadership commitment. The second one, it's complex. There is no silver bullet. There's a lot of goodness that comes from DE&I. We call it, in a way, it can be a holy grail, but it's deceptively difficult. So you need a clear ambition, you need clear actions, and we say both inside and outside four walls. What does that mean? Inside, it's about your talent development, it's about performance management, it's all of that. But outside of the four walls, it's about how you bring products to your customers, but also how you think about your suppliers and how you push them to be diversified. That's the movement we've seen, especially with a lot of CPG companies, that's consumer products companies. They're really pushing their suppliers to be diverse because they want to be diverse. And then you start to get a full ecosystem. Then organizations will be judged by results, right? If you have a big ambition, but you make no strides, in the end, you're going to get a big minus from society. But at this point, and I'll go into that in a second, at this point, it's also important to speak out. So in the end, actions speak louder than words, but they both matter. To come out and to say that you care and that you've got an ambition at the moment goes a long way. Now, again, you need to follow it up. The third one, D&I and actually ESG, so it's about environment, social, and governance, is the next digital. Why? Because it's going to bring the change and it's going to accelerate the unlock when it comes to power of people. And especially, and I know I'm drinking my own Kool-Aid, so I'm very sorry, but I think diversity, equity, and inclusion is going to give us the tools to put people in their strengths. Every single human being has got unique talents. No one like you has ever been on Earth and will never be on Earth. So take up what you have and all the talent and the different strengths that you have and do something with it. And I know I can sound a little bit fluffy, but I certainly believe that that's why we're on Earth, to figure out what it is that we do here and to bring our strengths and make a difference. And every single person can do that. but we need to be open to it, and it needs the environment, if you will, all of us together, to give that a chance. And last but not least, it's a journey, not a destination. Oh my goodness, if you look at it, I know a lot about behavior change, and behavior change is just a little piece of the bigger journey. It takes time. It takes time and persistence and a plan and coming back to it and getting it wrong and then fixing it. That's what it is, which is why it's so hard. But the best companies at this moment are the ones that get on with it and start to chip away at it. And that brings me to the next one, is organization are at different stages when it comes to D&I journey. We do a lot of research also looking into, hey, what are the leaders? There's not a question I get so often as the lead of D&I in EMEA as, hey, where are the, who do we have as examples? The truth is, no one has actually figured it out completely. There are companies that do some things well, but not across the board. And so we call them, in a way, emergent leaders. So you've got the ones that are very strong in terms of where their ambition is. So Starbucks has done, even in 2020, they had like a big announcement on they're going to be inclusive and they're committing to it, etc. And that is part of the way to do it. When you look at, for instance, Unilever, by the way, they sometimes also get it wrong and then they apologize, but they have relatively inclusive marketing campaigns. They care about, for instance, body shapes. And so how do you tailor to that? You also have, when it comes to, for instance, Netflix, they do a great job when it comes to talent acquisition and how they look at the diversity of teams, because they truly believe that that makes a difference. So there's good news and there's bad news. The good news is no one's has figured it out, so you're not necessarily behind. The bad news is no one's has figured it out, so it's not a copy paste. It's about persisting, and it's about making steps and committing and learning. And then if we did some research also on this, we believe there are 4 big pillars that if an organization wants to really make a difference, there's 4 things or 4 category of things that you need to think about to do differently. One indeed is about the strategy and the governance and the accountability. Make sure that you have an ambition, that you've got a plan, that you follow up on it, that there's consequences if you don't get there, etc. The second one is about an equitable talent journey. Again, it's not the same for everyone. Do you understand why certain pieces of your organization go faster when it comes to promotion versus other? Would there be a real intellectual difference, or could there be a systemic thing? And by the way, there's a lot of systems that obviously were built for the majority population because that's what was there before. What are the unintentional things that could have creeped in? And can we be honest about it and change them? The third one is truly about the inclusive culture. We said it before, you can be as diverse as you want to, but you're going to lose all your diverse talent if you don't have an inclusive culture. And inclusion matters to everyone. So you can start today and you can start to make a difference. And there I would even say, what is at the crux? It's about listening to people's stories and taking the time to connect to them as human beings. I had a wonderful quote the other day, and it's not even by a famous person. It says, an enemy is someone whose story you just haven't heard. Now, is that always true? No, there's atrocities that I don't want to go there, right? There's atrocities that are hard. But oftentimes when we get in a fight, have we really taken the time to understand where the other person comes from? And if not, what if we would? So those are inside the 4 walls. And then you've got outside of the 4 walls, and that is about supplier diversification, but also making sure that your products are, for instance, Lego, I think, was one of the first to start bringing out gender neutral instead of just girls and boys toys, right? Those are just a couple of the things that you can do outside of the 4 walls to continue to push diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I think that is basically the end of this. I want to have 5 minutes in the end for people to do some reflecting, but for now, I'd love to start and open up the Q&A if possible.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Bianca. That's the first thing I want to say for taking the time so far and sharing your insights here. I think we all agree this is an immensely important topic, and the work that you are doing and continue to do, I think, brings us forward quite a bit and helps us make progress on this. We do have some questions from the audience.
Great.
On this one, and there's the first one that I'd like to start with is actually one that I've been thinking about myself, and it's come from Maria, who voiced that there seems to still be a lot of resistance from men on the topic to support women, especially at the workplace and in especially that context. And the question is whether there's any recommendation from your side or any learnings that you've seen in the past to improve this and to reduce resistance, and I suspect increase awareness on the other hand.
Yeah, it's a very good question. So if there is no openness for someone to even listen, that becomes very hard, right? I mean, that is the hard fact. But I have to say, with all of the things happening, given George Floyd, opening and starting the conversation has gotten easier. And like I said, and I don't know whether that's a good recommendation, but what I've seen work best is if there is a data piece in terms of actually we don't have that many women, combined with some anecdotes about how certain women feel, because otherwise there's not a case for change. There's many people, or many men also, but also women, by the way, who just think, well, women just like to be at home more. It's just, that's nature, right? Until they hear how other people think differently, nothing's going to change. So I hope there's a little bit of, some of the advice make sure that, you leave an article on the table somewhere that says something, right? That people get exposed to it a little bit more, and share your stories. One of the things that sometimes helps, but it's hard to be straight or it's hard to address directly, are things like, a lot of the men in higher positions, some of them have got daughters. What would they wish for them? That changes the ball game. Now, how do you do that, right? It's much more, if you have a coffee, ask them about their daughter. I mean, it shouldn't be this, it still needs to be authentic. But people change if they understand who it's for and they understand the lived experiences.
That makes a lot of sense, and actually is, from my own experience, something that I've found very powerful to rely on, to learn about other people's perspectives through anecdotes.
So Freddie, it's an interesting one because you told us about your partner and how she felt that made you change. We've got
very much, yes,
a couple, like even an AC, so someone who just joined Bain. When I was having my interviews with him, we got into this conversation about DE&I, and he told me about his Italian girlfriend who had lived all of her life in the Netherlands and still had trouble sometimes. And that made him wanting to make a difference in this space. There is a guy who actually wants to make a difference on women at Bain because his wife is having such a hard time when he was still in Japan. So it's that type of stuff, right? Anyway.
No, I fully agree. As soon as anecdotes in general, but as soon as they touch people that are close to us, they become just infinitely more powerful. We have a next question here from Divya, who speaks a little bit about this awareness and empathy. So the question that she's posting is that we all have different experiences and we all have different stories. So sometimes it can be hard to show empathy and to realize that there is a need for allyship. And so the question is, how can we develop a broader outlook and open our minds and eyes more to these situations? So how can we enhance and deepen our horizon in that sense?
Well, it depends on if you're already aware, and that's what I said a little bit, right? You can educate yourself. So it's mind your own gaps. Like I said, that's why I'm starting the book on race migration in Europe, just because I want to understand what it's like, because I don't know enough about it, and that makes me more blind than I at least want to be. So you need to be open to some of those things, I would say, Ferdinand. I'm not sure when it comes to broader than that, it's hard to force people to get educated. And actually, again, that's why some people don't like the term majority blindness, because even if you tell people they don't like something, they can say, you know, what I hear a lot, by the way, in business is, I don't want to lower the standards. So if that's your mindset, then you truly don't yet believe that there is an upside. Otherwise, you wouldn't be talking about it in the same way. So when it comes to true deep mindsets, and I'm also a professional coach by now, but it's hard to change it fast enough if you don't work with people then in a one-on-one setting when it comes to really changing. But they need to be open to that too, right? And that's the big thing. And actually, that's why I do that's why I'm focused on the human side of change. People don't change because we want them to. They change because they want to. So the big thing is to understand what is the question that they would want to get answered from their perspective that would actually make it better for the other groups. So what can you find in common? What do people care about? That's why, even though that might sound a little bit cheeky, but that's why I said, you know, if you ask people about their daughters, they will change their behavior because they think about it in a different way. So it's much more about how do you make sure people get exposed to the different angles, and that's all you can do. And I do think we're in a momentum in society where it's hard to look away. But I have seen enough people to say the right thing, to tick the boxes, but not actually change. So when I work with leadership teams, it's not, and actually this is not just in DE&I, this is behavioral change in general, or culture in general. It's like we all want to be making fast decisions and we all want to be accountable. That's easy to say yes to. But if you take a moment of truth in which people don't take accountability and you ask them to do something different than they did, are they willing to? Are they going to commit to that? So if you truly want to go deep, you need to say, what are the moments in an organization that being not included hurts the most? Bring that to the team that needs to change. Get them to come up with what they want to do and what's holding them back, etc. And then to commit to change. Not to 1,000 things, not all the time, 180%, it doesn't work. But pick a couple of things, get people to commit with it, give them time to learn and keep each other accountable. That's the only way. And unfortunately, it takes time. It's not a one workshop and we're done. You can have a start, which is also why, in my view, the one-off D&I trainings won't help. They will create awareness. It's like TED Talks. You can be snacking on inspiration, but does it actually change your behavior? You need much more rituals and things like that. Otherwise, you're not going to change. And that takes a lot of commitment, but that's what it takes.
I think an important point that you mentioned there, and that also was on my mind earlier, is that it's actually a cultural change, and that it's a cultural change in organizations, in societies, wherever you want to apply it. And so I think what you're saying makes a lot of sense. It needs conscious and continuous efforts to really ingrain it in mindsets.
Sorry.
No, please go ahead.
No, I was going to say, the way we look at culture, actually, it's your purpose and your values translated into your behaviors. That's what culture is at large. It's behaviors at large. That's your culture. And so you're right. It goes to the fundamental piece about purpose and values. And if some way, somehow, the fundamentals of DE&I aren't truly in there and lived, it's very hard to get the right behaviors. Sorry.
Yeah. Not at all. I am just conscious of time because you mentioned you would like to use the last 5 minutes of our session to reflect on the topic.
Yeah.
So I'd like to give the lead back to you here.
Well, I will, but Ferdinand, were those all the questions? I can't see them, right? You're my master of ceremony here. Were there questions still, or are we through most of them?
We are through most of them. There was one very quick one on the topic of majority blindness that you've mentioned earlier. Whether there are any resources some people would be interested in reading up on this or catching up on the topic that you could recommend.
Oh goodness. Well, there's one book I really like, but it's in Dutch, which is called Deep Democracy, and it goes to ranking in majority blindness. And it's a South African tool to begin with. So Deep Democracy is one. And one other one that is not necessarily about majority blindness, but something I would recommend, especially the last episode, is Steven Spielberg has made a series that's called Why We Hate. And in the last series, it tries to unpick why we're trying to see people as our out group and not our in group, and what happens and what you can do about it. And especially the last episode and I'm not going to give the plot away, but it's about Colombia and the FARC, and it's got such a beautiful piece in there. And it is about listening to each other's stories, and it doesn't make it good. It doesn't make violence okay, but you can understand and you can see each other as humans again. And that's the crux. As soon as we don't see people as equally human, that's when the hate rises. And we do it in many different ways. Anyway, so that's my recommendation.
Thank you very much. I can't wait to check those out.
Yeah, please do. And so, yeah, my last question, but it's for all of you. And maybe Beryl and maybe Ferdinand, you're willing to share. But my last thing for all of you would be to say, reflecting on the session for today, is there any action you would take or an insight you're taking away? That would be my question for all of you.
I have been thinking about that slide where you showed like different stages of companies, like in their diversity and inclusion journey. So one important thing is to, I think, define those moments of truth and actually realize who are doing it best and try to spread it out, because it's very hard to first identify them, second, know really what to do. So I will definitely be more aware in finding those moments, because really change happens with behavior, and the more moments of truth we identify, I think the more we can change, because awareness is only, I don't know what % of change, but just the beginning.
Yeah, but it's a very important one. No, I like it, Beryl, and actually we use this a lot too in change. Looking for bright spots and blind spots. Yes, we know we have blind spots and we need to tend to them, but where are the bright spots and where you do see something that worked out? Because that means it's possible. And if we see it's possible, it's much easier to believe that we can do it too. So it's lovely. Thank you for sharing that one. Ferdinand, am I putting you in front of, am I throwing you under the bus, or are you willing to share?
Not at all. I'd love to. It's actually connected to what Beryl just said. And to me, one thing that I kept hearing throughout this conversation was habit development. And I think it's not an easy thing to develop new habits, especially when they require effort to put in place. But I think there are two things that in the past I've found very, very helpful. The first one is role models, to surround yourself and notice the people that are good at speaking up and being allies, at sponsoring people around them, and try and learn from them. Maybe even try and copy them. If that's the first step to do this and to get better at it, use that. And the second one I found really helpful was, a lot of the times there are situations that we later on reflect on, or they pop into our minds and we think, oh, actually, I should have spoken up there and I should have done something. And what helped me in the past was to keep a journal of these situations and reflect on what should I have done and why didn't I? And it's a very specific thing to do, and it might be silly for some people, but I've found it actually be quite useful.
No, thank you, Ferdinand. The only suggestion I would make is that you also keep the journal of the times that you did speak up, because those powerful moments that are like your bright spots, right? You spoke out as being an ally. So also just make sure that you celebrate those as well. Anyway, thanks everybody. I don't even know whether I'm the one thanking everyone, but I hope this was helpful, that you took something out of it. I think Beryl is going to tell you where to put your feedback, because I just want to continue to learn and get better and be more relevant. And so any type of feedback you can give for all of three of us, but especially for me, I'd welcome it with open arms. And thank you.
Thank you so much, Bianca. This was amazing. All of the insights that you have given. I would like to close the session with a short reminder of the SDG Week program. We have sessions coming up on climate, sustainability, education, and more gender-related topics. So you can register to those sessions on SDG Week website. And lastly, if you want to give some feedback, there will be a link as soon as we finish the session, and you can find us on social media, and we will be very happy if you were to tag us. Thank you very much. Have a nice evening.
Have a great evening, everybody.
Thank you very much. Have a wonderful evening.